In 2009, Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2 was released, and it chronicled the time Roxas spent while he was a member of Organization 13, fleshing out the year between Chain of Memories and the start of KH2. However, unlike Chain of Memories, the soundtrack for Days was actually much fewer in terms of new original themes. Altogether, there are 13 credited pieces associated with the anthology soundtrack that included Days, and of that 13, only 8 of them were unique melodies. Despite this, many tracks from previous games reprise their role, and there are some interesting narrative observations to be made among the pieces that Shimomura introduced through Days. I went through the original Nintendo DS game, as well as the cutscene movie included in the 1.5 collection, to catalog all the sound events for this story. This information, as always, is available in the spreadsheet document in the video description. With this document, we can categorize all the music just as we've done before, in terms of field, battle, event, character, and miscellaneous tracks in the Days soundtrack. In previous charts, I haven't made the distinction between event tracks and miscellaneous tracks very clear, but for Days, event tracks will simply be story relevant and miscellaneous tracks will not. Just as was the case for Chain of Memories, the Days 1.5 cutscene movie also changed some of the instances where various tracks would play, but almost always for the better, by replacing somewhat overplayed music with more specific pieces. For example, the general Sacred Moon Castle Field theme was often replaced with the track Xemnus during scenes that involved Axel and Syx talking with one another. Because the new tracks composed for Days are so few, we can spend more time with them one by one. We'll do that in just a moment. Now, because of the small soundtrack, the musical impact of Days ultimately wasn't too influential to the series. But still, at least a handful of melodies in this game ended up becoming among the most beloved in the community, and exploring some of the threads that connect these pieces to the web of music in the saga so far can be useful. At the very least, it will be interesting to see what narrative connections can be drawn from these tracks, and how they're used for the story of the Nobodies that culminated in Roxas's defection from the organization. Here is the connection diagram for the music in this game, but again, don't be deceived by the considerably fewer relationships between the music in Days compared to those in previous charts. A lot of the narrative impact of the OST was more self-focused through evolutionary tracks and reused themes, rather than being concerned with growing Shimomura's network of motifs. In a sense, we can look at the OST of Days as further payoff for the success and musical strength of the previous trilogy, the KH1, COM, KH2 Foundation. We could go through all the families in this chart like before, but I think it would be more useful to just talk about each of the new tracks introduced in Days individually. Then we can talk a little bit about some notable reuses of pieces from previous games, and finally finish with a broad overview of the musical contribution Days made to the series. Before we do all that, let's take a minute to address the evolutionary themes that were modified specifically for this title. Days had many themes in its original soundtrack that served as evolutions of previous tracks. This is a concept introduced in the KH2 video, and there will be other tracks that will evolve in the subsequent games. It's interesting to take notice of the tracks that are modified in this way to get unique instrumentation or new sections. These melodies imply their significance by not being replaced with new tracks altogether. Shimomura still finds them strong enough to still have meaningful weight in certain scenarios. Sacred Moon, for example, is used throughout Days, but later superseded by Mystic Moon for a specific event. Sacred Moon is a track that serves in this game as the Organization Foyer field theme. This area, called the Gray Area, is where Roxas is given his daily missions. While Sacred Moon plays its melody with choir and piano, Mystic Moon is slightly darker by giving the melody over to solo cello and strings. This piece plays only one time in the original game, on day 355, when Roxas decides to leave the organization. All this aside, there's no new melodic material in Mystic Moon to differentiate it from Sacred Moon. The purpose it serves is a shift in tone, amplifying Roxas's resolve to escape the castle. The two tracks completely share musical material, the difference between them being instrumentation. The track Deep Drive doesn't appear in the game, but an instrumentally reworked evolution of that KH2 melody called Critical Drive replaces it. In Days, this battle track plays for the Versus Syx confrontation, as well as the Neo Shadow encounters as Roxas approaches Memory's skyscraper. Similar to Deep Drive, the same nobody texture in piano returns as a fundamental element of Critical Drive as well, paralleling the frequently used nobody battle theme, Tension Rising, that plays for many battles throughout the game. The same link to the 5-note Organization 13 motif that exists in Deep Drive is also here in Critical Drive, contour-wise. Finally, the KH1 track, Another Side, is developed into a full battle loop for the Roxas vs. Riku showdown at Memory's Skyscraper. The original plays in the cutscene before, but this new battle loop of the track fades in during the gameplay. We've talked before about the connections this track has with Organization 13, and also Dastati, so I won't continue to belabor the point. So now, on to the real meat of this soundtrack. Let's talk about all the important new pieces introduced in Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2. We can begin with the Days arrangement of Dearly Beloved. Like all previous arrangements, this Dearly Beloved still incorporates Always on My Mind from KH1. This is also the first instance of a Dearly Beloved that uses instrumentation to match the musical focus of the story or the characters. We can hear the immediate and continuous use of solo flute used to play the Always on My Mind countermelody over the piano. The whole arrangement is slightly less orchestrated than the KH2 version, due to Shimomura being told that the team wanted to jump in more quickly, but it seems like a purposeful choice to feature flute so prominently, considering that the protagonist of this game, Roxas, uniquely features this instrumentation in his theme as well. I think the flute here is a clear connection to Roxas and how the story will center around his year. The next track in the OST, Results and Rewards, is actually surprisingly well connected despite how relatively unimportant the track is. This piece plays for the Mission Complete review screen exclusive to the Days multiplayer mission mode. It's super odd that Shimomura was asked to create a new track that essentially serves the same purpose as the single-player Mission Complete track Crossing the Finish Line, but this piece actually contains a lot of elements from other tracks in the series. Crossing the Finish Line was originally used as a route complete track in KH2's Gummy Mission review screen, so its purpose remains consistent between these games. More noticeably though, seemingly borrowed from Crossing the Finish Line is the Sora rhythm in low brass. This, I think, just strengthens the idea that Results and Rewards was composed using Crossing the Finish Line as a template, and functions in this game essentially just like the Gummy track. The last element we can take notice of is the Dastati bass pattern that has shown up in many of the final world tracks from the previous 3 games. Typically, this element signals an imminent threat or warning to the player, but you can hear again that it's not exactly the same loop. Likely, its incorporation here was more like a wink rather than having any lofty narrative purpose. The track Fight and Away is actually one of the somewhat common late-game battle tracks that's completely unique to Days. Because of this, it comes across kind of structurally strange in comparison to the many KH2 battle themes that have been playing throughout the game up until the point where it's used. I have no hard evidence to suggest this, but the track seems much more similar to the music in Chain of Memories than it does to any of the other themes composed for Days, due to the forceful use of brass that sounds a lot like Revenge of Chaos. as well as the incorporation of organ similar to tracks The Fight for My Friends and Struggle Away, maybe thereby earning its strange title. These instrumental observations imply, at least to me, that Fight and Away may have been intended for use in Chain of Memories, but it was originally scrapped or shelved. Coupled with the very tiny original tracklist for Days and the somewhat extreme backlog of reused themes, it may have been the case that Shimomura was running on a tight deadline, as she was composing for Days, Birth by Sleep, and Coded simultaneously. This is complete speculation, but it wouldn't surprise me if the developers had asked for a quick battle track that ended up sticking in the final published game, and Shimomura had found this unused piece among her files for Chain of Memories. The track Xemnus is also a little bizarre, and in more ways than just the clear misspelling of Xemnus with an A.
Xemnas.
It behaves in the original Days like Disquieting from Calm and Hesitation from KH2, playing only during a cutscene in Mission 42, when Xion sits on her bed recalling her confrontation with Riku, during which he called her Keyblade a sham. So it's strange that this track doesn't play in the original game during any Xemnus-centric cutscenes. Further, there seems to be no musical links between the track Xemnus and his other associated themes like Disappeared or Darkness of the Unknown. The 1.5 movie used this track in many more places than the original game, though. It ends up replacing a few uses of Sacred Moon and Organization 13, but almost exclusively in scenes where Saïx speaks with Axel about their plans. Because of these uses and the implied motivations of Saïx giving Axel orders without Xemnus' permission, I also think of this track as another traitor theme, just like the track 13th Discretion from Calm, but again, there's no musical link connecting those two either. For these reasons, the track Xemnus is unique and specific, but it serves a familiar role. Neverland, like Twilight Town and KH2, apparently gets new field themes for different characters that visit the world. You'll recall in KH2 that Sora's Twilight Town field theme is The Afternoon Streets, while Roxas's is Lazy Afternoons. The setting of Neverland is different than it was during KH1, but Roxas's field theme in Days is a new track called Secret of Neverland. We'll also see that as Neverland is visited a third time in Birth by Sleep, it also gets another new field theme in that game, making Neverland one of the most musically diverse locations in the Kingdom Hearts universe. As far as I've been able to tell, Secret of Neverland, as well as the battle theme Crossing to Neverland, share no musical material with the related KH1 tracks, Captain Hook's Pirate Ship, Neverland Sky, and Pirate's Jig. At Dusk, I Will Think of You is what Shimomura ended up titling her Ice Cream Time theme that plays for most of the Twilight Town Clock Tower meetups between the Sea Salt trio. This track is almost completely original material. I imagine that Shimomura finds making any explicit references to other themes like Lazy Afternoons or any other Twilight Town tracks substantially more difficult when she goes through so many rewrites of a theme, in this case at least 8. That said though, I can't help but notice how similar the ostinato throughout the track is to Roxas's ostinato. They both begin as direct reversals of each other, harmonic differences aside. I know that saying a connection between two pieces that share such tiny similarities is admittedly flimsy evidence, but a lot of the important tracks in Days seem to be based around 3-note repeating patterns like this, such that I think there is some intention in their composition being related in this way. At the very least, similarities like this could shed light on a composing mindset at the time of writing all these pieces. Another very small thing to notice that may have served as some source of inspiration when composing At Dusk is the use of similar pizzicato phrases present in the back of the track for Sora's Twilight Town field theme, The Afternoon Streets. Its use, more likely than anything, probably isn't a reference of any sort whatsoever, considering that this also appears in the track Friends in My Heart and others, but the similarities may be worthwhile to take note of, if only to recognize how Shimomura often employs the technique to offer a sense of comfort or belonging. Now, Xion, a new character to the series, is given a unique theme in Days. Her track, and forgive my French, literally, Musique pour la tristesse de Xion, translated is Music for Xion's Sadness, and typically played in the original game in scenes where she was featured in a cutscene that did not include the clock tower. The 1.5 movie increased this and ended up replacing a few of those "At Dusk I Will Think of You" instances at the clock tower with her theme, and Shimomura later commented that Xion's theme is compositionally Ravel-esque. To give some insight as to what this means, Ravel and his contemporaries, like Debussy, are associated with musical impressionism, which is an artistic era that focused more on mood and atmosphere and less on melodic subject matter. Shimomura is saying that Xion's theme was intended to be more atmospherically developed, rather than melodically developed with a traditional form. Xion's theme is the first in the series up to this point that's explicitly referential. It quotes Kairi's theme, musically echoing Xion's condition as a puppet composed of Sora's memories of Kairi. Whenever Shimomura wants to make a reference, she usually lays it out pretty clearly for the listener, just like this. But I also looked around for anything that could have been inspired from any element of Sora's theme. I didn't find anything obvious, but although it's probably coincidental, there is this little phrase at the end of Xion's statement that could be a link to this part of the climax in Sora's theme. But again, this is probably unintentional considering how small the phrase is. Nevertheless, it's a fun commonality to take note of. An interesting contrast between Roxas and Xion's themes also exists. It's notable that the main Roxas ostinato is a pattern of 3 falling pitches, while Xion's is a pattern of 3 rising ones, and we can note that these are 2 of the 3 themes in this game that use a 3-note pattern like this. In a sense, this musically connects the two and can show how Roxas and Xion's abilities with the Keyblade draw from the same source. As one rises, the other has to fall. The music that ultimately plays for Xion's final form battle is Vector to the Heavens, which is essentially a battle version of Xion's theme, paralleling Roxas's battle theme in KH2, called The Other Promise. Vector to the Heavens has been given many arrangements over the years in the form of Sachiko Miyano's work, in all KH orchestra concerts as well as the KH piano collections. It comprises mostly Xion's theme, as well as a clear statement of Kairi's theme, and also Dearly Beloved. In most of the climactic battles for the series, as I've talked about before, the tracks typically incorporate some element of Dastati, which Shimomura has said represents the dark side of Kingdom Hearts. So I wonder if the use of Dearly Beloved here in Vector to the Heavens is emblematic of a compositional philosophy in the KH series. Hero themes, characters associated with light, using Dearly Beloved, and villain themes, characters associated with darkness, using some part of Dastati. The use of Dearly Beloved here could also simply be an extension of the piece's meaning to Shimomura. She sees Dearly Beloved as a track that represents precious memories, and nothing could be closer to the thematic purpose of Vector to the Heavens as Roxas battles Xion, a puppet whose identity grew from Sora's most precious memories of Kairi. All the connections in Vector to the Heavens make narrative sense and are thoughtfully incorporated such that the listener immediately knows the stakes of the battle at hand. Surely, this is at least part of the reason why this track is so popular in the Kingdom Hearts community. These were the 13 pieces included in the Days OST. Now we can take a look at some of the more interesting uses of tracks from previous games that get reused in Days. Of course, Roxas's theme is used, but it might be surprising to learn that it only played 3 times in the original game. Stranger still, Roxas's battle theme, The Other Promise, also appears in both the game and the movie, but it happens on day 356, when Axel talks with Xion outside the Twilight Town mansion. Roxas is not directly related to the scene at all. It might have been more narratively cohesive to instead play Scent of Silence to emphasize the secrecy element, Another Side to amplify the intensity of Axel's promise to, quote, always be there to bring you back, or even just Xion's theme, considering how infrequently it's used at all. It's a strange choice. I'm glad Roxas's themes do appear throughout the story though, and not to discount how great Critical Drive is, but I wonder if The Other Promise might have also been narratively impactful to consider for the Versus Syx battle. Regarding Cavern of Remembrance, recall that this piece is the field theme for the area in Hollow Bastion that eventually led to the Garden of Assemblage, where Sora could battle data versions of Organization 13. Because of this association, I think it's appropriate that this piece was used as the character's select screen track for multiplayer mode in Days. It might have been fun to hear an original track, but considering both uses in KH2 and Days have the player effectively choosing an organization member to interact with, it's a surprising employment of the volatility and multifaceted nature of field themes in this series. I really like its use here. We've talked before about how Shimomura considers Treasured Memories and Missing You as part of a set that are meant to accompany scenes involving important memories, and it's nice to hear a few uses of both themes throughout this game. Treasured Memories is clear, and it plays during both Roxas and Xion's time on Destiny Islands in reference to memories. Missing You uses are more diverse. Scenes like Roxas visiting comatose Xion at her bed, Roxas and Axel eating ice cream after an unsuccessful Organization imposter chase, and most of the Naminé scenes. I said it was nice to hear that both were used in Days, but I admit that Missing You remains a little ambiguous here. It makes sense for the scenes where Roxas literally expresses how he misses hanging out with Xion, but scenes in the 1.5 movie where Xion formally introduces herself to Axel for the first time, or the quick shot of Naminé drawing in the White Room, seem appropriate, but don't actually match the track's previous use in KH2. It unfortunately appears that Missing You often simply gets relegated to general sad cutscene number 2 sorts of uses, which is a pitfall of reusing music from previous games, where such things as the use of a piece might be left to the scenario writers rather than the composer. Strange Whispers is used several times throughout Days in much the same way that the track Just Wondering was used in Chain of Memories, albeit that Strange Whispers feels like it's a track with a little more gravity. I had said before that Strange Whispers usually played for the scenes involving Robed Ansem in KH1, but taking a look back at its use in KH2, then comparing both those to Days, paint a much clearer picture of what this track is supposed to represent, which is that it's a mystery theme. It plays in Days when Roxas asks if Axel had been eliminated in Castle Oblivion, when both Roxas and Xion enter Castle Oblivion for the first time, and also the scene where Xigbar tells Roxas that Axel had let Xion escape in Wonderland. All of these uses fall very neatly into the unraveling a larger mystery kind of categorization. It's very interesting and commendably appropriate that the track Disquieting accompanies the only scene in Days where Mickey meets with a hooded figure in the Twilight Town woods. Disquieting originally behaved in Chain of Memories as a villain introduction track, and is grounded further by this use as Mickey appears to be threatened by this figure that looks like the villain Ansem. No other tracks in this game, or other games, have as effective non-Disney villain introduction themes, so this is a wonderful reuse of an established track from Shimomura's discography. Destiny's Force already had a pretty clear use case, but this was further cemented in Days as well. This track played for mostly sub-boss encounters in KH1 throughout the late game, but it always accompanied Darkside, and Days paid attention to that. This game reuses Destiny's Force very effectively for all the Pureblood Heartless missions Roxas encounters, those that involve Darkside, Neo Shadows, Dark Followers, and the Orcus Invisible-esque Heartless. It is also oddly used for the Xion vs. Xigbar cutscene where Axel lets her escape in Wonderland, but nevertheless, its narrative purpose seems to be, for the most part, pretty clear, that of a Pureblood Heartless battle theme. The final interesting piece we can address, Tension Rising, initially baffled me in how it played for tons and tons of Heartless fights throughout the game, but eventually I came to realize that this nobody battle theme wasn't carelessly used as just a catch-all battle track to play at the KH2 nostalgia, but the narrative implication of doing battle with a nobody makes absolute sense because Roxas is a nobody. Tension Rising isn't describing the enemy in this game. This time, it's describing the player. This was just a few of the most notable reused themes in the Days OST that reprise their effective roles and solidify their purpose in this game. We could have also talked about how Rowdy Rumble returns as gimmick fight battle music, or how the 1.5 movie uniquely and correctly used the track Apprehension for immediately dangerous situations, but I think those described here give a general satisfying idea about the kinds of cases where Shimomura's work from the previous 3 games comes to bear fruit, and continue to show how a storied soundtrack can evoke the same emotions and memories in different settings. Being clear in a track's use goes a long way in giving the player an anchor to invest themselves further in the stories where these tracks are used. Although Days didn't have many original tracks in its OST, the ones that were composed for the game accompanied critical moments in the story more often than not. Any new musical connections between these originals would have been difficult simply due to the size of the soundtrack regardless, and yet Shimomura still found important elements and weaved those threads together for characters like Xion and Roxas, as well as for key places like the Grey Area and Twilight Town. Just like the story was meant to fill in the gaps between Chain of Memories and KH2, the soundtrack parallels this mission by also reusing themes from these games, for the most part, very appropriately and with respect to their previous uses. I'm hopeful that this discussion gave reasons to look back at the soundtrack of Days with more nuance. It's a game that set out to explain the yet unexplained, and I think it does so effectively with a soundtrack that's more thoughtful and wide-ranging than it might appear at first glance. To move forward with the story and the musical connections therein, we first need to look back. The next game whose music we'll talk about is Birth by Sleep, a tale that focuses on 3 Keyblade wielders and a conflict between 2 masters that set in motion all the events of the Kingdom Hearts story in the Dark Seekers arc.